That would be caffeine.
Why is that?
How caffeine works is it acts as it dulls the pain sensories basically. So people often think caffeine gives me energy. It doesn't give you energy, it just dulls pain sensories. So you can push harder for longer. Obviously carbohydrates are important for performance, but when it comes to sort of the nitty gritty of performance, once you've got that down pat, I really think that caffeine is just a really good performance aid. And a very simple thing to be using for both training and definitely for racing.
Okay, so how would you go about using it for training?
So again, it comes down to the individual. So some people will avoid using it in training if they want to use it in racing, so that they have that more effect, I guess.
Does it have more effect, or is that just mental?
It depends on the person. Some people can still feel the effect. It will always work. It's just whether or not people feel it. And half the reason is so that you do feel that performance effect. So they're the people that don't drink coffee though. So
okay, yes.
If they're not going to be having it on a regular basis. For a training perspective, again, I would only use it around those key performance sessions. So you don't need to be using it in sort of your low intensity zone 2 rides, because there's no real performance benefit that we're trying to drive there. We would choose the quality sessions, key sessions over the week. And again, it really depends. Are we going to be using it before training? Are we using it throughout the session? It depends on the length of the session as well. Generally in training, it's probably a pre-train supplement, unless it's a long training session, and then we can add caffeine in between or throughout, sorry. But it also, it's something that I love to promote with my clients, is trying to use their training nutrition as a practice for their race nutrition, because a lot of athletes have a really solid race plan that they never practice in training. Okay. So it's trying to practice that race planning as much as possible.
What have you seen work best with your athletes that you work with? Is it better to have the caffeine beforehand or during? And is it better to have high doses or to drip feed?
So with training, I think it's nice to have it beforehand, because typically the sessions are going to be a little bit shorter. So we want that to kick in sooner rather than later. So usually it's sort of that 30 minutes beforehand, I'll get them to take caffeine. Again, that could be through just a coffee. Keeping in mind, it's very difficult to measure the amount of caffeine in a coffee. Every coffee bean's different. A pod's different to espresso versus instant and things like that. So we can gauge, but often we'd be using products, so whether that's from potentially a no-dose, caffeine strips, caffeine gum, a gel sports drink that has caffeine in it. There's a number of different products that we can use, and it's just we figure out what's going to work best for that particular individual. So roughly sort of 30 to 60 minutes beforehand that we're going to have that dose. Now, it depends how much else they're going to have throughout the day, because caffeine is really important to understand that more is not better, and that it can be potentially even lethal if you have too much. I've had a particular member who has had far too much during a race by accident, and they ended up in hospital. So I really want to make that clear, that more is not necessarily better. And that the performance dose that we're looking for is anywhere from 1 to 5 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram body weight.
Okay.
Usually that 3 milligram mark is great, but we don't then jump to 5, because often you'll get the same benefit from 1, 2 or 3 milligrams that you will as 5. So the least you can use, the better. Doses of 10 milligrams per kilogram body weight can be very, very harmful. So it's always being mindful of that.
Okay. And for an event or for a race, should they be using that same strategy? Let's just say they were taking caffeine before their training session. Should they be doing it before a race? Because you mentioned in the live just before that there's some nuances there. Some people get really nervous before an event, and if they have the caffeine with the nerves, it's going to exacerbate the situation. Yeah,
so race planning becomes a little bit different. And again, this is the sort of things I've been working through some of my RCA members on, is a solid race nutrition plan. When it comes to caffeine, it really depends how nervous you are. So if you're a nervous racer, caffeine can increase your heart rate and can actually exacerbate that feeling. I know I've done that myself before an event, and it's really backfired, and my heart rate's been through the roof on the start line.
You're burning energy before you start, are you?
Well, yeah, it's just you're making yourself more nervous than you need to be, and that perceived effect of heart rate being high before you've even started using energy can be really detrimental to your psychology on race day. So if you're a nervous racer, I actually don't use it in the pre or maybe a very small dose in your pre-race nutrition, but it might be something that we start on hour 1 or potentially towards the back end of the race, depending on the length of the race. I still use around that 3 milligrams per kilogram body weight,
Yes.
up to 5, as I said, but definitely no more than 5. And some athletes even work well with just 1 milligram of caffeine per kilogram body weight as well. So it could be, if it's an endurance event, definitely throughout. And sometimes we wait till, halfway to be using that. With caffeine, it, as I said, it doesn't give us energy. It reduces our perceived effort, so we can push harder for longer. So it's not, you're not just getting an energy boost, you're being able to push harder for longer, but we do want to try and have it before you hit that wall, essentially. So before you really start to feel pain in an event. So that takes practice in training to figure out where that is. So if it's roughly a 4-hour event, we may take it at the 2-hour mark and then the 3-hour mark. I'm a big fan of having a bolus as opposed to drip feeding, because again,
what's that?
So having a larger dose, but fewer doses.
What's it called? A bolus?
A bolus.
Okay.
Yep, so having a larger dose but in fewer doses, as opposed to just drip feeding caffeine consistently over an event.
Okay.
And the reason for that is because it's strategic. It's a bit of, you feel that perceived effort.
Boost,
so yeah. And as I said, it's not that energy boost, but it's just a perceived energy boost.
Yes.
Basically.
What happens if you take too much too soon in a race, in like a 4-hour event? Can it have a detrimental effect in making you...
Absolutely. And you don't want to take it too early, because typically, hopefully your fitness will get you through this to the first half of an event.
Yep.
It's usually something that I would use as an aid throughout the back half of an event. So if you're taking it far too early, yes, it will. Caffeine lasts a long time in the system. Half-life is 6 hours, so it is going to last. But typically, your body is naturally going to want more of it, because you want that feeling of that perceived, boost.
Yes.
So I would sort of typically wait till about the halfway mark and then have a couple of doses thereafter, depending on the event, obviously.
Okay, and a lot of people have their caffeine with gels. If they're having a gel during a race, what should they be considering? My understanding from previous conversations is there's a certain amount of liquid fluid that they should also be taking with the gel. So what do you recommend there?
Because it's a really highly concentrated carbohydrate amount, we've got
With
to be
caffeine.
mindful. A gel. So absolutely need to be mindful that we're having enough fluid in at the same time. So roughly that 200-300 mils to make sure that the gut's able to digest that gel. If you're looking at caffeine, and typically I actually don't recommend gels with caffeine often.
Okay.
The exception to the rule is the Morton, because it's a high dose, it's a 100 milligram dose.
Okay.
Most gels sit, and S Science and Sport as well, they do a higher dose of caffeine, which is 75 or 150. I really like those two, because again, we can use a higher dose bolus, rather than a lot of gels are usually sort of 20 to 40 milligrams of caffeine, and then you have to take a lot of them. And so that's more of a drip feed, and it just becomes a little bit more complicated when we're trying to calculate out carbohydrates and fluid and things like that. I try to separate my my carbohydrate products from my caffeine products. So we specifically have a caffeine product coming in at this hour, this hour, this hour, or this many kilometers, as opposed to combining products, because it's just a little bit of an equation that may not end up perfect.